I think it's fair to say that Syracuse basketball completely failed in the transfer portal. And Mike Waters wrote a great article about Syracuse's offseason. And don't worry, I'm not going to be absolving the coaching staff either here on this podcast. Let's get right to it.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day, and we are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And on today's show, we're going to talk about the article that Syracuse.com's Mike Waters wrote earlier today, breaking down Syracuse basketball's offseason, why they failed, the transfer portal, NIL, all of that. All right. It's a great article. It includes multiple sources in it about player values, which I think is really important to understand. And I think it's also safe to say that the transfer portal haul of Eddie Lampkin, Jyare Davis, Jaquan Carlos, and Lucas Taylor was a really poor haul. And overall, I think the intent of Mike Waters' article was to kind of absolve Adrian Autry and this coaching staff for this offseason, but I actually think it makes them look a whole lot worse. So we're going to break down Syracuse's NIL budget, what they got right, what they got wrong, and the fact that Syracuse did not appear to be prepared for the transfer portal last offseason. Now, before we get to everything, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. First question: is Syracuse basketball broke? Do they have no money? Do they have no NIL? Well, the article actually dives into that. According to sources in the article, Syracuse's NIL budget for this season was a little more than $2 million. Now, I could throw out a number and say $2 million, but you would have no idea what that actually means. There needs to be context behind it. Well, according to the article, a little more than $2 million was middle of the pack in the ACC as far as NIL budget. But for context, Louisville, one of the better programs in the country now, had an NIL budget of about $4.5 million, and they are currently a projected 6th seed in the latest ESPN bracketology. So again, it goes back to what I have been saying for a while now, which is that Syracuse, heading into this season, did not have the NIL to be able to compete with the big boys and be a top seed in March Madness. But there is still no reason. NIL is not a valid excuse for the fact that Syracuse is 11-16 and 147 overall in the net rankings. In fact, let's go over some schools that are actually ahead of Syracuse in the net rankings. Are you ready? And you could tell me yes or no whether or not you think that these schools have more NIL resources than Syracuse. Ready? Let's do it. Furman, Towson, DePaul, James Madison, New Mexico State, Western Kentucky, Kennesaw State. You want me to keep going? Those are the only schools that I listed that are above Syracuse in the net basketball rankings. You tell me who has more NIL, Syracuse or James Madison, Syracuse or Kennesaw State. So NIL, as far as it being a valid excuse, to some extent, because Syracuse cannot be a 1 seed, 2 seed, 3 seed. They're not on that level, but I mean, 11-16 overall, one of the worst teams in the ACC. Give me a break. It's not a valid reason. Furthermore, this article really grinded my gears. It starts off talking about the Kadary Richmond saga when he entered the portal. Kadary Richmond was one of the top transfer portal players available last offseason, and he entered it on April 25th at the very end of the transfer portal window. It's entirely possible that Syracuse had more than a little over $2 million that they're leading you to believe. And I'm going to tell you why. Because in the article, it says that Syracuse offered Kadary Richmond $700,000 to play for Syracuse. Ultimately, that wasn't even close to being enough because Kadary Richmond ended up signing with St. John's for $1.2 million. I don't care how many relationships you have. You are not going to get a player to take a $500,000 discount. $1.2 million versus $700,000, that's not being in the ballpark. You're not even in the same area code at that point. You're not even close. But what I found interesting is that Syracuse offered $700,000 to Kadary Richmond to play for Syracuse when basically every move was done. The roster was nearly set in stone when they offered him $700,000. There were only 2 moves that Syracuse made after Kadary Richmond. You ready? It was Lucas Taylor in the transfer portal from Georgia State and Peter Mastorovich, the true freshman from Europe. I can promise you that those 2 players do not combine to make $700,000. In fact, it is significantly less. So the idea that Syracuse is just broke, A, not entirely true because they were already middle of the pack in the ACC, and B, where did the $700,000 come from to offer Kadary Richmond? Hello? Bueller? Anyone care to explain? Was it special money that they only had available for Kadary, but if it wasn't used for Kadary, they simply weren't going to use it? $700,000 is a lot of money, I should say. It doesn't just pop out of thin air. So I'm not really buying that Syracuse is broke. I understand that they were middle of the pack in the ACC, but they came up with $700,000 at the end of the offseason to give to Kadary Richmond when they only made 2 moves after Kadary Richmond said no. Lucas Taylor and Peter Mastorovich. Eddie Lampkin had already signed. Jyare Davis had already signed. Jaquan Carlos had already signed. They already knew that they were getting those players. Number 2, we learned J.J. Starling's value. Now, before we get to J.J. Starling's value, when you're on a tight budget, your margin for error is really thin, right? You cannot afford to make mistakes on value because when you make those mistakes, you cannot spend more money to overcome those mistakes. Like when a program like Louisville, who's spending $4.5 million on its players, makes a mistake, they can overcome it because they have more money available to spend, right? But when Syracuse, let's say operating at about $2 million, a little more than that, when they make a mistake, your margin for error is a lot thinner. That also means you're going to need to find players on value contracts, value NIL deals, players that are outperforming their value. Well, we learned in this article from Mike Waters that J.J. Starling is massively underpaid. He is making less than $300,000 in NIL this season. That is less than Frank Anselem, Louisville's apparent third-string center. Oh, by the way, you remember Frank Anselem? Frank Anselem played for Syracuse in 21 and 2022. According to the Mike Waters' article, he's making $300,000. Are you kidding me? I'd take J.J. Starling for that. If I were to say conservatively, if J.J. were to hit the open market right now, $500,000 is probably a fair estimate given the market. But he's only making $300,000, so they're losing. They're 11 and 16 overall, in danger of missing the ACC tournament, despite the fact that their best player is on a bargain deal. Yeah, that's not very good. That's an indictment on this coaching staff. Really? It'd be one thing if J.J. Starling was making, I don't know, at least $500,000, $750,000. Then you would maybe have a little bit more of a case, right? That's not necessarily good. That's maybe fair value, but that's not an overperformance. But you're getting a lot more than what you're paying for from J.J. Starling. And I've had my criticisms of him. I do not think he's a perfect player, but he's worth more than what he's getting, and you're still losing. So overall, is Syracuse basketball broke? I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it from this article. Again, it's in it. Facts, according to sources, they're spending more than $2 million. That's middle of the pack in the ACC. Not great, but also $700,000 just appears out of nowhere to get Kadary Richmond, which wasn't even close to being enough, but you still had that extra $700,000 when most of the moves that you made that offseason were already done. So they're not broke, and we learned that in this article. Now, coming up, we'll talk about what Syracuse got right in the transfer portal, which is really not much, and how Syracuse basketball could have landed Malik Mack and Dakota Leffew. So stick with me here on Locked On Syracuse. March Madness is almost here, and there's no better way to get in on the action than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With PrizePicks, you pick more or less on at least 2 player projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. In fact, it's fast, easy, and keeps every game exciting. I love how I can make my picks in less than 60 seconds and stay engaged all game long. And when I win, my money hits my account in as little as 15 minutes. No waiting around. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONCollege for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. I'm Jackson Holzer, and this is Locked On Syracuse. And folks, we're going to continue talking about Mike Waters' article released earlier today about Syracuse's transfer portal, offseason NIL budget, and the fact that the Orange just completely failed last offseason. And it's evident the fact that they're 11-16 and in danger of missing the ACC tournament. We talked about whether or not Syracuse basketball is broke, and to summarize that for you in case you missed it, I'm not buying it. I don't think they're broke. And number 2, let's now talk about where Syracuse was right and wrong in the transfer portal this offseason. Now, they didn't get a lot right, but they did get one thing. So credit to Syracuse on this. Apparently, Syracuse targeted a center from Ole Miss at the time named Moussa Cisse in the transfer portal. The Orange were interested in him, and then they balked at his asking price when it was at reportedly $1 million before he ultimately decided to go with Memphis. Now, would Cisse have made the team better? Sure. He's a good center. He's good. He's a good defender, at least. I believe he was an all-conference defender at one point in his career. But he averages for his career 6 points and 6 rebounds. You do not pay $1 million for a center that averages 6 points and 6 rebounds. You better be Dikembe Mutombo as a defender, or else you're totally not worth $1 million. So Syracuse did get that right. In fact, we learned how much Eddie Lampkin is worth in his NIL deal, $850,000. I would rather have Eddie Lampkin at $850,000 plus an additional $150,000 in NIL available compared to Moussa Cisse. So I think that Syracuse basketball got that part right in the portal. And for those that are saying, well, Eddie Lampkin's worth too much, if you think Eddie Lampkin is worth too much money, right, or is not worth $850,000, then you think that centers in general in the transfer portal are worth too much, because centers in the portal are the most expensive position compared to anyone else. They are. A middle-of-the-road center is going to cost a ton of money, as we saw with Eddie Lampkin. Frank Anselem, who we detailed in the last segment, makes more money than J.J. Starling, and he is a third-string center at Louisville, and he is not very good. He's never averaged, I think, 3 points a game in a single season. He stinks, and yet he's making $300,000 plus. So centers in general are worth more than probably what they should be. So Eddie Lampkin at $850 is actually not bad value compared to everyone else. And I'd rather have Eddie Lampkin at $850 plus an additional $150,000 than Moussa Cisse. So Syracuse got that part right. But they did get one thing really, really wrong. What if I told you that Syracuse could have gotten Malik Mack and Dakota Leffew? What if I told you that? What would you think? Those were 2 pretty good players in the portal. Malik Mack overall was one of the best players in the portal. He was an all Ivy League player in his true freshman season. And I know you're going to sit here and tell me you don't want mid-major players, but he's actually having a pretty good year at Georgetown, averaging 13 points and 5 assists per game. Georgetown plays in the Big East. That's a power conference in college basketball. That's pretty good. He translated quite well. He's not perfect, but Syracuse could have maybe had him. And they could have had Dakota Leffew. I get that he's coming from Mount St. Mary's, but he's at Georgia right now, averaging 10 points a game off the bench in the SEC. It's not bad, right? I think Syracuse would have been a better team with Malik Mack and Dakota Leffew. Well, they could have had them both. So we know from the article that Syracuse offered Dakota Leffew anywhere between $250,000 and $300,000 for him. He ultimately decided to sign with Georgia for $400K, give or take. Malik Mack decided to go to Georgetown at give or take $400,000. So Syracuse basketball was interested in both of these players, Malik Mack and Dakota Leffew, and they would have cost them in the neighborhood of about $800,000. Now, you could sit here and say, well, just don't sign Eddie Lampkin and go get those guys, right? Because Eddie Lampkin was at $850,000. You could say that, but Syracuse did need a center in the offseason, so they had to spend to get one. Here's how Syracuse could have gotten Malik Mack and Dakota Leffew. It's pretty simple. Number one, you don't sign Jaquan Carlos. You don't sign Lucas Taylor. And if you want to throw in Peter Mastorovich as well, fine by me. You don't sign those guys. So you save that money. You give them to Dakota Leffew and Malik Mack. And number two, you offer that $700,000 that you apparently had available for Kadary Richmond to those two players. That would have been enough to potentially get Malik Mack and Dakota Leffew. There's no guarantee that they would have come and said yes. There's no guarantee, but I guess that goes to show you that Syracuse just, whatever money they did have, they spent it really poorly. That's clear. They spent it poorly because they could have had them. That part really pissed me off. Those guys only combined for about $800,000. You had it. You had $700,000 for Kadary Richmond. You paid Jaquan Carlos and Lucas Taylor. That's $800,000. You had it. It's right there. And I understand that, well, you wanted to save that Kadary Richmond money in case you actually got Kadary Richmond, right? Because you'd rather have Kadary Richmond. Here's the issue. You weren't in the ballpark for him. It's one thing if you had $700 only for him and Kadary Richmond goes to St. John's for, I don't know, $750. I get that. Like, you're close. You're in the ballpark. You could have gotten him, but you're not even in the same area code for Kadary Richmond. And by the way, Kadary Richmond was rumored to be entering the portal for over a month. You should have at least known what he was going to be asking for and should have known that $700,000 was not going to be enough to get him. They really could have just taken that money and funneled it to other players. It doesn't even have to be Malik Mack and Dakota Leffew to improve the backcourt. It could have been anyone in the backcourt that they could have given it to. So overall, it's just they got that entirely wrong. They got it wrong. That's pretty clear now. They're not a good team. And coming up, we'll talk about how it's inexcusable. This article may have been written to kind of give the coaching staff a pass, but it actually makes them a whole lot worse. So stick with me here on Locked On Syracuse. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether I'm backing my team for a late-game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three, I never feel like I missed my chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Syracuse basketball, and their coaching staff specifically, was not prepared for the transfer portal last offseason. And that is inexcusable. Now, I understand that Syracuse, in June or July, they hired a general manager by the name of Alex Klein. And Alex Klein is going to get his chance to shine this offseason. That actually rhymes, Klein and shine. Didn't mean to do that. So they have a general manager. But how can we absolve the coaching staff for what happened last offseason? Mike Waters at the end of the article gave his 3 takeaways and his final analysis, as he called it. His first one was the coaching staff didn't delve into potential transfers available until after the season ended. His second takeaway was the coaching staff did not know the price tags on these players. So they weren't prepared for what players could enter the portal, and they weren't prepared for what these players were going to ask for. And then his third takeaway is that Syracuse lacked NIL funds, which he's wrong. He's wrong. His own reporting actually directly contradicts it. By not being prepared and understanding value, Syracuse basketball ended up with Jaquan Carlos and Lucas Taylor instead of Malik Mack and Dakota Leffew, or any other 2 possible guards that the Orange could have gotten in the portal. Keep in mind that Syracuse declined an NIT bid to be prepared more for the portal. Apparently, it did not work because they weren't prepared to begin with. And this article, again, it was, I think, meant to kind of give them a pass for the roster that they constructed. But it actually makes the coaching staff look a whole lot worse. It's a massive indictment on them. How does this article not raise alarm bells? They weren't prepared. They weren't. That's an excuse? Hello? I mean, did they not know when the portal opened? I mean, you should know more than I do, or anyone else should, about players that could enter the portal. And you should have a decent idea of what these players are going to be asked for. Being ignorant, not being prepared, are not excuses in my book. And furthermore, it's not like Adrian Autry and this coaching staff are in-game coaching geniuses. The offense is incredibly stale, and they have not played defense in 2 years. Seriously, 2 years they have not played defense. The team is incredibly reliant on ISO ball for its offense. It's give the ball to your best player and let him do something. And again, the team just doesn't play defense. Keep in mind, they were also 68th in preseason KenPom. They are now 129. Oh, but the injuries. What about the injuries? When J.J. Starling and Donnie Freeman were on the court at the same time, was Syracuse good? Were they a good team and then they all of a sudden were bad? Those are the 2 best players on the team, right? I don't think they were good. Remember the first 3 games of the year, how much we all panicked by them? Barely beating Lemoyne, barely beating Colgate, going to double overtime against Youngstown State. Lack of NIL funds. Injuries were not an excuse then. Getting clobbered by Florida State in the ACC when they were both on the court, that's not valid to me. So overall, my takeaways from this article were the coaching staff wasn't prepared. They're trying to use NIL as an excuse for it, and it's not. It's not. They have middle of the pack NIL money in the ACC. That's not great. No one's going to sit here and say that they can't or that they shouldn't. Let me rephrase. Nobody is going to sit here and say that Syracuse shouldn't need to increase its NIL, that they have enough. To compete for a national championship, they don't have enough NIL money. We're in agreement on that. The issue is that they're not competitive. The issue is that they're in danger of missing the ACC tournament. You have middle of the pack ACC in funds available with NIL. You magically had $700,000 available at the end of the offseason for Kadary Richmond. The coaching staff is also not exactly wizards in game. It's deserved if they are let go after 2 years. Barring some miracle turnaround this season that I don't think anyone anticipates is going to happen. It's deserved. And that's why if and when that they do retain this coaching staff, we're going to have to do the 5 stages of grief, which is normally meant for a loss, but really in this case, it's going to be for keeping. And ultimately, we're going to have to come to accept it. Because if they decide to roll with them for another year, they decide to roll with them for another year, and there's nothing we can do about it. But this article was meant to really put in perspective, which I think it did. But I don't think it really accomplished the goal of absolving Adrian Autry and the coaching staff. It made them look a whole lot worse. It really did. And for those that didn't catch the article, it's floating around out there, but I'll just link it in the comments section for you all to read it. And I'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the article in general? I do appreciate Mike Waters writing the article. I think it's a great article because it does give some perspective on player values. I mean, we learned in the article that they could have had Dakota Leffew and Malik Mack for $800,000, but they didn't get them. Right? We learned Eddie Lampkin's making $850,000 according to sources. We learned that J.J. Starling is massively underpaid at less than $300,000. So it's a great article. So you guys, I think, all should read it and come to your own conclusion about it. And let me know what you think in the comments section below. Thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen today. For your second listen, you can check out the Locked On College Basketball Podcast with Isaac Shade and Andy Patton. Don't wait for March. Be the most informed college basketball fan right now. Find Locked On College Basketball on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. As far as what is coming up on Locked On Syracuse in the future, I'm going to try to get on Kenton Gibbs and Grayson Boone from Locked On Wolfpack because Syracuse and NC State play a huge game on Wednesday. So hopefully we can have a crossover episode breaking down the game and the stakes of it, aka the loser of that game might just miss the ACC tournament outright. And I believe I'm scheduled to go on with them tomorrow, but it's going to be later. So I don't think that episode will come out at the usual 6 p.m. Eastern, like normally full podcasts come out on. All right, so that's just a heads up for you all. All right, so thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for listening. If you like this podcast, be sure to hit that like button. If you really enjoy the podcast, be sure to hit subscribe. Tell all your friends about Locked On Syracuse so this channel can grow and reach all Syracuse Orange fans. And I will see you all again soon.